There's a book that has the reputation for creating more millionaires than any other book in print. If this is the case, could the advice in this book be the best financial advice in the world?
We're going to cover the financial advice in that book and see how it can apply to your finances today.
This is the book. It's The Richest Man in Babylon.
The Richest Man in Babylon was written by George Clason in 1926 out of Denver, Colorado. It's a collection of parables, and they're set in ancient Babylon. The characters include, of course, the richest man in Babylon, his friends, the professional tradesmen, merchants, even a gold lender from ancient Babylon who are all sharing their perspective about the way money works.
As we were preparing for this podcast, I was reviewing the foreword written by George Clason, and I was especially struck by this paragraph that I want to share with you. This book deals with the personal successes of each of us. And then he goes on to define those successes. Success means accomplishments as the results of our own efforts and abilities. Proper preparation is the key to our success. Our acts can be no wiser than our thoughts. Our thinking can be no wiser than our understanding.
But that's the case, Michelle. I know that this book was given to me by a very, very wealthy man when I was 25. And he said, Tom, read this book and you'll never have to worry about money. But my understanding was a 25-year-old. And it wasn't until I was 45 that I understood what Clason was really talking about in this book. Because I was busy focusing on just rates of return and what my compound annual growth rate was and my internal rate of return here and there. And I was missing the biggest point that Clason makes in this book.
Well, I'm going to poke at you just a little bit because you said your understanding of a 25-year-old. Well, that doesn't mean every 25-year-old has that same understanding, but your understanding at a 25-year-old was not where your understanding was as a 45-year-old. So it's not really an age thing. It's the level of your understanding. And at that point, you didn't have the level of understanding required to understand how to put these principles into work.
That's true. And as time goes on in life, hopefully we get wiser instead of more foolish. But when we don't listen to the advice of people like Clason or the mentors that came in my life later that taught me to think in percent and what free cash flow was, then we get all bound up in what the world wants and how can we accumulate so much and what's my rate of return and all this, and we miss the point about what wealth and success really is.
I love this book too as a read aloud. I would read this to my kids. John, you might even remember that.
I remember you reading it to us, yes.
And I remember a 6-year-old at the time, Stephen. He's in the studio right now doing the recording. But I was having a little problem with him not wanting to do his studies, just, giving me pushback, not wanting to do his work. And we were reading this book, and in the book, there's a story of a slave. He was really sold into slavery because he hadn't been responsible. And the treatment that he gets because he is having a mindset he doesn't want to work. I remember Stephen sitting up and squaring his shoulders and saying, I'm going to work like a free man. And that goes back to the success George Clason talked about. That mindset is so important.
And freedom isn't just being able to do what we want anytime we want to do it. It's the freedom to discipline ourselves so that we can be more successful. And that's what our founding fathers understood about the general welfare of these United States, is that it was individuals that would pull up the general welfare, not the government handing out welfare checks. When we realize that, when we have that freedom, if we're responsible with it, then we can pull ourselves up, and in doing so, we're going to pull up everyone around us. And that's what I finally understood when I was 45 and got really excited about it, because the better we can make anybody's personal economy, the better the whole economy, the macro economy is going to be. And we've got a government right now that's fighting against. We've talked about inflation. We've talked about taxes on this show. And we need to have some way to not necessarily fight back, because they're always going to win because they're bigger than us, but some way that we can outpace them And that is what George Clason is teaching us here.
So this book, it starts out with a parable of two guys talking who are hard workers. One of them was a chariot maker, I think, and they're friends. They're talking about the work that they do and how they never seem to have anything to show for it. Many Americans can relate to that situation in today's economy. They go to work, they work hard, and then all the bills come and the expenses, and all of that money ends up walking out the door. And one of the takeaways from that, as it applies to a financial situation, is that a portion of everything that we earn should be ours to keep. And the Richest Man in Babylon suggests that that should be at least 10% of our income. And what is the difference between keeping money versus saving money?
Well, when we keep something, we nurture it. We take care of it. We pay attention to it. We cause it to grow. We're very attentive to it. When we save something, it's kind of like hoarding. You just put it away, tuck it away, and hide it over here, and hopefully it grows. And even Jesus, when he was here on earth, told two stories about keeping money versus saving money. And one was a story of the talents in Matthew 19. The other one was a story of the minas, which was a year's worth of wages in that time. That story took place in Luke. And each of those stories had one of the people save their money. And
They just buried
They
it.
just buried it. They hoarded it away. They saved it. And they were condemned, and what they had was taken away from them and given to the people that had kept the money and made it grow. And so what Clason is teaching us here is that 10%, at least 10%, is the seed that is going to grow your success, that's going to grow your wealth. And it's the cash flow, the cash cushion that we've talked about on this show before, that is going to help us be more productive and more profitable.
One of the things about having money that you're keeping, in the book, it talks about it becomes the gold coins jingling in your purse. That as you go around, you hear these coins jingling, and it helps you hold your head up high. That you are not just spending everything that you make, but that you're accumulating wealth. And again, we're talking about a mindset here. So even when our kids were young, we had them carry a $100 bill in their billfold, 5 years old, 6 years old. They've got that with them, not to be spent, but just to carry. And the mindset that encouraged them to realize they didn't have to spend everything that they had, but they could walk into a store and there was the money to get that item if they so chose. They didn't choose because we had talked to them. But it's that mindset, being able to hold the head up.
You mentioned the mindset, and as it applies to keeping 10% of everything you make, there's a different mindset that goes into somebody who is going to intentionally set aside 10% of what they make and live on the rest versus somebody where life just happens to them and the expenses that come in are not as well planned because they will automatically grow to equal that income, and it becomes a victim mentality instead of proactive plan for the future.
And what Clason says in this book about keeping that 10% is that someone that has that money in their purse or in their keep, they're more capable, they're more loyal to their country, and they're more loyal to their family. And those who do not have that capital, that gold in their purse, that money that they're keeping, are not loyal to themselves or their country or their family. And that is really, really true. This book and the book of Proverbs, if people would just read those two books and understand the financial principles that are in each of them, would be much more successful in life.
Besides the keeping 10% for earning, they talked about having a profitable employment, an employment that you're earning the money that you need to live on. I think also with profitable employment, there's also a mindset there again. If you're in an employment that is not emotionally satisfying, that is more difficult to do that to do that activity. And so I think it's important to look for something that's also emotionally satisfying as well as financially satisfying. And if you can marry those two together, it becomes easier. Or sometimes you just have to look for some aspect of it that is more emotionally satisfying. So sometimes people have to work for an employer and they don't have the opportunity to have their own business. Well, I remember years ago hearing that you can work for yourself, even though you have an employer. And when you have that kind of mindset that you work for yourself and you determine what kind of attitude you show up with in the morning, that's just a little bit of a mind shift, but it can make a huge difference.
And if you're caught in a job right now that you're not emotionally satisfied with, then just sit down and list out the things that you are happy that you're employed, because that's where it starts in being able to create the job that you're looking for or the career that you're looking for that is emotional satisfying. You can't just jump from one to the other without being grateful for where you're at currently.
So once you have, you're keeping 10% of your income, then there are some laws of gold, which the richest man in Babylon goes over, and how you make that grow. Because so many people want to take the savings that they're earning and they want to force it to impossible returns so that they can achieve financial success even faster. But that goes against one of the laws of gold that says that those who try to force gold to impossible earnings or who invest it with people that are not skilled in its management are going to stand to lose.
There was the man who gave his earnings to, I think it was the bricklayer, to go invest in jewels. Well, that was not his specialty. And of course, there was a loss there. But we see that all the time. People are so excited about making investment. They think, oh, I'll get this great return. And they don't even know much about the investment. And the less you know, the greater your chances of losing the investment. We see that all the time. So that's an ancient principle. You need to invest in something you know about.
The first rule of gold in this book is keeping at least 10%. Another rule is don't invest in things that you don't understand. Make sure you really understand it. And don't try to get rich quick.
When we come back from the break, we are going to talk about how this financial advice applies to modern America and people we know who have used this advice to change their lives. As the show wraps up, don't turn it off because we have a video to show you of the best financial advice we found on the Las Vegas Strip. You will love it. Let's go to the break.
While we're on break, I wanted to ask you to review the Wealth Talk show on Apple Podcasts. Over the years, we've received several reviews. Most of them were positive, but there are a couple negative ones. And Apple, for some reason, is choosing to feature those reviews, so it looks like our show has a 2-star rating. We're hoping by getting some more recent reviews, Apple will feature those and reflect a more accurate rating for the show overall. So please go and review the Wealth Talk show on Apple Podcasts. We appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Everyone's financial situation is different, but the beautiful thing about the 10-20-70 principle is that whatever you make, there's always 10, 20, and 70%.
And a little bit of responsibility in one area will grow into more responsibility. So if you're applying that responsibility with money, if you have a little bit to manage right now, you'll be able to apply the same principles when you have a lot to manage.
And that's directly from the words of Jesus Christ. He who's faithful in little will be made faithful over much. And that applies across the board, whether we're talking about money or we're talking about responsibilities or anything. And that's one thing that people fail to realize, that when you find a truth, it applies across the board. They fail to be able to draw the analogy from their situation, from a story or a principle or someone else's life, and they want it all played out just for them. And yet those people that are wise and have the understanding can take the story or the example or the failure or the success of someone else and apply it to their own life and get similar results.
This is something you will need to do if you're going to take the lessons from the richest man in Babylon and apply them on your own life, because the richest man in Babylon is a collection of stories. The lessons are there, but you do need to be able to pull the analogies. And some people have a problem with doing that. And this is nothing new. Jesus even talked about this in the parables that he told in the Bible, that some people would hear but would not understand. And so being able to make the jump from understanding, enjoying the story to pulling the lessons out of that story and applying those in everyday life, that is a skill that you can develop.
Aesop's fables is another example. You know, the story of the little dog going over the bridge with a bone in his mouth, and he sees the dog is a reflection in the river with two bones, and he lets go of his own bone to get the two bones. We see that so frequently when people are talking about their finances. They have something they don't realize they have. They look at someone else and go after it, and they've lost it both. And now they start all over again. And so I'm thinking of a doctor in Michigan that years ago called us when we were first starting this concept, and they were spending more than they were making, which is a very common thing as we work with people. High debt, paying 20, 25, 29% on credit cards. And I remember just asking, are you worth at least 10% of what you make? He goes, well, I'm worth more than that. I said, then prove it to yourself, keep it. And he just began to keep 10% of everything he made.
He was just keeping it in a dresser drawer, and you told him to do that for 3 or 4 months, but he called earlier than that.
He did. And he said, Dr. Tom, I don't know what to tell you, but I have a wad of money in my drawer, and we didn't even miss it. And that's the principle here. Every time we've challenged people to do this, since that time, they've always said the same thing if they followed through with it. They have a wad of money, and they didn't even miss it, because the 10-20-70 principle is truth. And when we follow it, it works.
And hard work is a given. You're either going to work hard and not have money to show for it, or you're going to work hard and have money to show for it. So which would you rather do?
And too many people today don't want to put in the work or the effort or the education that's necessary to generate more wealth.
It's true. Some people are looking for a shortcut, but those aren't the ones who are really going to make it in the long haul.
I'm thinking of another client who very, very successful investor. She's in her late 50s, early 60s, has been successful all of her life.
She was a high income earner in her occupation, and then also does real estate investing on the side.
That's correct. And once we introduced her to the 10-20-70 principle, she goes, oh, wow, this is so simple. I've been keeping this spreadsheet and that spreadsheet and all this other stuff. This just makes my life so less complicated. And now she's set free, and that's freedom because she's following a principle that's been proven to be true, and it's going to allow her to be even more productive because she's not going to spend all the time doing all those spreadsheets and data collections and everything. It's just 10-20-70.
Too much analysis can get in the way sometimes. And so simple is better as long as it works. And so a simple system that works, it's so much better. And this is something that you can draw from the analogies in this book. They're simple. They're applicable. If you try to take a complex system and make it into a system of rules, you'll fail because you can't remember all the rules to apply at the right time. I think of the people who sit down and they want to know every single detail. Okay, what do I do step 1? What do I do step 2? And they're going to write this down, and nothing ever happens because nobody can remember that. But if you learn the principles so that you can apply them later, that's what's really going to count when push comes to shove.
Or people want to get all these lists of things to do and study all the different ways they could invest.
And sometimes it's wise to do that, to research those things.
Right, but it's not good to not get started with something. And a lot of people are so busy looking for all the different things that could add to their wealth that they just don't get started.
Or they just procrastinate. They say, well, I'll get started next week. Or I'll start, next month when I get my raise, or I'll start next year when we're moved to a different place. No, we have to start where we're at. And we talk about that in our book, The Prescription for Wealth. You're here. That's where you've got to start. And just because something's simple, and the 10-20-70 principle is very simple, we don't make it simpler than it is. And if we do, then we fail to take the message, and we think that there's no work involved in it. And the work is always there because we live in a world that requires work.
You just brought up the 10-20-70 principle. So far, we've talked about the 10% that is yours to keep. The 20 and 70 portions of that, these also come from The Richest Man in Babylon. Once you keep 10%, then 70% of your income, that's for living expenses, for lifestyle. And then the 20%, that's the maximum that you want to pay toward creditors.
And of course, Clayson says that 70% is not just my lifestyle, it's the lifestyle I support my wife and family with, because that gives me esteem about being somebody that's helping other people. And as time goes on, if we continue to spend 70% on our lifestyle, we're either very greedy or very self-centered. Because as we learn to manage money the way Clayson says here, it's not going to take 70% to satisfy a good lifestyle.
I really like the way he talked about the 20% too, because a lot of times when people have debt that they've got to pay, there's a real negative connotation around that. And he approached it differently. He said that he realized that his creditors allowed him to use their funds to take care of things they needed to purchase. And so he owed them a responsibility of paying them back. Now, we don't have to like the credit card high interest rates, but we also need to evaluate, maybe we don't need to use that so much. And so to go ahead and pay that back with your honor because somebody entrusted you with that money. And so there again, we come to a mindset of how we think is so important.
Well, there's never going to be a time when we don't use other people's money if we're really going to be successful. Warren Buffett talks about this. Jeff Bezos talks about this. Mike Bloomberg talks about this. Other people's money, leveraging it is one of the ways that we can create great success. And of course, we talk about that all the time, about how we leverage the insurance company's money with our life insurance policies. But the key here is that the repayments on using other people's money should never be more than 20% of our income. Otherwise, we find ourselves cutting our lifestyle or not following the rule number one is keeping everything, at least 10% of everything we make.
Something that's beautiful about the 10-20-70 principle is that it is flexible. And this isn't to be misused, but what it does allow you to do is it allows you, if lifestyle is a little bit more in one area or another, then you can access some of your savings, use it for the lifestyle, but then make sure it gets paid back out of the 20%. Because you were using your own money, isn't it worth just as much as somebody else's money if you'd use somebody else's money for that? So it allows us some flexibility in these things. But it also, you just don't want to overuse that and get off track, because then you have to make big corrections trying to get back to that 10-20-70 rule. Rather than following a dollar by dollar budget where if you get off, then everything's up in the air again. The 10-20-70 allows you some flexibility with the ability to get back on track again.
As we wrap up today, we thought it would be appropriate to play a video of the best financial advice we found on the Las Vegas Strip. In 2015, we took a camera down to the Las Vegas Strip and asked people for financial and retirement advice. This is the best advice we found.
You can't spend everything that you earn. You have to put a proportion away, whether you put it in real estate, whether you put it in stocks, or just put it in a bank. Stop spending everything you earn. A message for the U.S. government, too. They spend what they don't earn.
Don't spend everything you make.
Keep at least 10%.
And hopefully you'll be able to keep 30%, because when you do, you'll get ahead financially much faster.
Subscribe to Wealth Talks podcast, because next week we will talk about why the graduated income taxes are un-American and abominable, right here on Wealth Talks.